Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Decoding AQ. I've been looking forward to today. We've got a Hall of Famer with us. We have Todd Cherches. Now, Todd is the CEO and co-founder of Big Blue Gumball, a New York City-based management consultancy firm specializing in leadership development and executive coaching. In fact, like many of our guests that we've had over the time, he's a member of Marshall Goldsmith's MG 100, but he's also a 3-time award-winning adjunct professor of leadership at NYU and also a lecturer on leadership at Columbia University, TEDx speaker, and an author of a groundbreaking book called VisuaLeadership, leveraging the power of visual thinking in leadership and life. So welcome, Todd.
Ross, thanks for having me. This is great. I look forward to this conversation after watching so many of your prior shows. I'm honored to be a guest.
Awesome. So as a kid who loved TV and who wanted to work in the TV industry, you know, who dreamed of being Superman or maybe even Batman, how did you end up becoming one of the top thought leaders in the world in sort of management and design thinking? How did it start? Where did it come from, Todd?
Well, I could show you, in terms of visual thinking, I could walk you through all 30 years of my visual bio, but I'm not going to do that today. But basically, growing up as a kid, who was obsessed with television and reading, both of them, and comic books, and all visual medium. So it's kind of like what I do today. I could always trace the roots back to the early days. So in terms, I was just asked recently, what are your superpowers? And I said, well, like Superman, I don't have X-ray vision, but I have the power of visual thinking. And like Batman, I don't have the utility belt, but I have a tool belt of visual thinking tools, tips, and techniques. So in some ways I have, and I try to save the world and make the world a better place, one leader at a time, which is my mission statement. And I try to do that through the power of visual leadership. So in some ways, I figured out a way to kind of like make that childhood vision come through, although I don't wear a costume or a cape, except in private, but I'm not even going to go into that. So long story short, I have a background. My degree is in English literature with a concentration in Shakespeare and poetry. So I like to weave the arts and literature as a thread in everything that I do. I worked in advertising for Ogilvy and Mather, my first job out of college. Then I realized if I really wanted to work in TV, most of those jobs were in Hollywood. So I needed to pack up. After years growing up in New York, I moved to LA, and I had a number of amazing jobs. One of my temporary night jobs, just to pay the rent, which I don't often talk about, I was a bouncer in a nightclub at night. So I'd be working at the TV studios during the day, and I actually wrote a pilot script called Bouncer by Night, about this guy who led this double life of being a bouncer at night and then working during the day. I couldn't sell it or get it published, but that's that. So that was part of my early career, but I worked for Disney. I worked for CBS. I worked for a number of TV studios and networks, and then I was a project manager in the theme park business for a number of years. So the recurring theme that came across throughout all those early jobs was toxic cultures and horrible bosses. So my book is dedicated first to my wife, secondly to my parents, and thirdly to all the horrible bosses without whom my career would never have been possible. So when I moved back to New York after 10 years in LA, I ended up with a job for a management training company, and that's where I got hooked. I realized, hey, management and leadership is an art and a science. It's something you can learn and develop and get better at. So I started getting addicted to all these management and leadership books, starting with like the Peter Drucker stuff, and that's what I do today. So I kind of fell into it as a result of having all those bad bosses. I'll stop right there. And so my visual leadership approach combines my storytelling and entertainment background, but applies a lot of those concepts and techniques to the practice of management, leadership, and coaching.
And it's often these opportunities of convergence, isn't it? Where we take things from one experience and apply it in a new way or in a new industry or a new world that we can create innovation. You know, a lot of the innovation comes from the naive mind. So that opportunity to come in that way is quite fascinating. And I think if I'm right, some of that inspiration about visual leadership and what you're thinking around there came about from a trip to China and some of the challenges it was around when you were working in the theme park. And just walk me through a little bit of that story, and maybe then how that impacted in what really is visual leadership.
Sure. Well, one thing you just reminded me of, there's a quote by the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who said that a wonderful harmony arises when we join together the seemingly unconnected. So just what you were talking about, when you take things like how Reese's peanut butter cup, right? You take the chocolate and the peanut butter, right? So I take my background in the entertainment industry and leadership, literature, apply it to leadership, and it's a whole new way of looking at leadership. So definitely right. Yeah, long story short, I tell the short version in my TED talk. I had never been in the United States before. I had taken a job as a project coordinator at a theme park production company, and the project manager was moved on to something else. And they're like, all right, you're the project manager now. And oh, by the way, you have to go to China to oversee the installation. Now, I didn't even know where Shenzhen was. It's just over the border from Hong Kong. So I get there and I realized that it's myself and my engineer and my mechanical guy. We had to install these life-size robotic animal figures that went in this cultural theme park. No one there spoke any English at all. They gave us a translator who spoke no English. So it's kind of like, what do you do? How do we get this done? And it turned out I started doing a lot of drawing. And even though I have ICD, which is I can't draw syndrome, I couldn't really draw, but I started sketching things out. So it was almost like Pictionary and charades. There was a lot of sketching and pointing. And somehow we figured out, this is actually a copy of one of my original, those who are watching this on video, my original napkin sketch. So if we needed a hammer or a screwdriver, and that's not too bad, right? For someone who can't draw that well, it's enough to say, hey, we need one of these, and we got it done. So that was when I got back and I reflected, I'm like, well, so often I made my master's degree is in communication, but so often we focus on the words. We don't focus on the nonverbals and the impact of visuals and things like that. So the light bulb went off. And it wasn't until years later that I really started to say, hey, this is a thing, this visual communication, visual thinking thing. But that was like an aha moment. So if I have to trace it back to an origin moment, that would be it.
And the example of being able to be aware of context, new situation, new environment, and adapting to meet an objective. That's what life's all about, isn't it? It's about understanding the situation and context, and then manifesting the way in which we consider communication, the way in which we react or even respond to certain things in order to do teamwork, to collaborate, to solve problems. And as you mentioned, to make the world better, maybe one leader at a time. But the reality of those things, when we have maybe challenging experiences or even awful ones, bad bosses that inspire us to maybe re-engineer a better way forward. What were some of the things that, wanting to work in TV, had these experiences that went into visual leadership, management consultancy firm, to then leadership and coaching? What really is it about coaching or about leadership that ignites you?
Well, one is I having had so many bad bosses and bad teachers, I try to be the type of manager and leader I wish I had. I try to be the kind of professor that I wish I had. I only had like 2 or 3. When I think back, that's the Paul Simon lyric. When I think back on all the crap I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can even think at all, from his song Kodachrome. When you think back, how many amazing teachers come to mind, right? Who are the ones who really stick with you all these years later? And I figured out that the differentiator was they cared about me as a person, as a student, as a kid, it wasn't about their teaching skills or their subject matter knowledge so much as they took an interest in me as a person. So whether you're a teacher, whether you're a boss, if you care, I always talk about caring as a competitive advantage, right? The teachers who care, there's that saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Caring is a way of really connecting, building relationships, showing interest in a person. It's empathy, it's compassion. Ties into diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. If you make someone feel that their opinion matters. I always talk about 3 V's: visibility, voice, and value. Do you feel seen? Do you feel heard? And do you feel recognized for your contribution? So these all kind of tie together. So my book is written like the type of book I like to read, and I try to be the type of professor and the type of coach that I wish I had at various points in my career.
The ability for all of us to have an experience and then consider, what do we want to throw away, or what do we want to repeat, or what do we want to evolve and change, is an interesting one, because then as leaders, we have a wake. of the ripple effects behind us in what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And often we can theorize or talk about or write about care and about taking interest. And I felt, for me personally, the best ones have not only shown that interest or care, but they've done it when it's perhaps inconvenient. And I think that differentiator of when it's rough seas, when the chips are, up against it, when you're really in a situation of high stress of maybe what we're experiencing right now, uncertainty. Can you show care when it's inconvenient? And I think that is perhaps polarizing maybe some of the situations we're seeing now in the workplace, of where when we need it most, maybe it's not there, the interest, because we're under pressure, we're under stress, and our gaze narrows into survival mode rather than the other. Is that something you're seeing? And how are you, if you are seeing it, how are you helping people to maybe overcome some of those things to ensure that care happens in inconvenient times?
Yeah, it's a great point. When under stress, it's very common for our worst traits to come up, or to get very selfish or self-interested and forget about other people. One of the things I often talk about, we live in, we all know the acronym VUCA. We're living in what I call a hyper VUCA world, because we're more VUCA than ever. And for those who may not know, VUCA is a world that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I wrote a blog post called, in a VUCA world, leaders need to do the opposite. So in a world that's volatile, leaders need to slow things down and calm things down, which is hard for me because I'm from New York and I talk loud and fast, as you could tell. I am an extreme introvert. And I always talk about myself as a 3Bs guy, a back of the room, behind the scenes bookworm by nature, but I talk loud and fast. People always think I'm an extreme extrovert, but I am not. So when things are volatile, we need to slow things down and calm things down, right? Take that urgency and panic and try to make things more manageable. In a world that's uncertain, there's always going to be uncertainty, but just separating what we can be certain about from what the unknowns are and trying to wrap our heads around that. In the world that's complex, and it's always been complex, but it's just more than ever because we're more global, things are moving faster than ever in technology and everything else. Can we simplify things? We always talk about thinking outside the box as being a cliche, but you can't think outside the box until you have a box and something in it. So if you can create some kind of framework, process, or structure to help you simplify that complexity so you can see things more clearly, it makes them more manageable, and then you can figure out solutions and approaches that maybe you hadn't seen before because you were so overwhelmed. And lastly, ambiguous. We're living in a world, there's that fog of uncertainty. If you could clarify certain things, if we can say, how can we use the metaphor earlier about navigating through the storm or whatever, if we could find our way and see, big part of leadership is vision, right? And my book is called Visual Thinking because it's about seeing things through a lens based on our backgrounds, but it's also about seeing the future. And creating a vision of the future that's different from and better than the current reality. Can we find some clarity so we can at least know if we're going in the right direction and see over the horizon? So that's my kind of summation on how I talk about VUCA and how we can, as leaders, wrap our heads around it to make it more manageable.
It resonates well with a concept that my coach, Dan Sullivan, talks about, of people are in two areas. They're a simplifier or a multiplier. When they get together, then that is poetry, but a simplifier comes first. You can't multiply until you've first simplified. And neither really is very successful without each other. And so that paradox of, simplicity in order to multiply is quite a fun one to think about. But the realities of leaders being able to have that duality, that ambidextrous viewpoints, to be able to trim and simplify and expand and grow at the same time. And we're often pulled in these multitude of directions. We have all these questions that we're trying to answer or figure out what the right questions are in the first place. Where are you seeing the opportunities with maybe some of the clients and things that you're working with at the moment to deal with perhaps some of the challenges around these complex things called people? And when, as we've said, many are feeling stressed, we might be feeling disconnected, we might have a toxic boss. All of these things have always been the same, But now it just seems very different. It seems like the playing field has shifted, and a lot of these playbooks are maybe not fit for purpose anymore. So what are perhaps some of the ways that you've seen organizations start to shift that, that yes, applying visuals or envisaging future, gaining clarity, all of those things. But what are some of the maybe stories that you've seen of that in reality happen well?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest issue of our time right now in the post-pandemic world is, and the focus of most of my work, is how do you manage and lead in a hybrid workforce and working world, where some managers are saying, all right, everyone back to the office after Labor Day, after, starting when the summer's over, everyone back to the office, and they're going to find like 3 people there, right? So it's kind of like, how does an organization meet its needs by also meeting and satisfying the needs of its people? How do you onboard people? How do you build culture? How do you create collaboration in a world that's so scattered and fragmented and complex, and people are all over the place? There's some managers who want to turn the calendar back to 2019 and let's pretend this whole thing never happened. But to use a few metaphors, the cat's out of the bag, the genie's out of the bottle, and the train's left the station, right? You can come up with whatever, toothpaste is out of the tube, whatever you want to call it. We're not going backwards, right? So the most effective managers and leaders will be those who can figure out a way to, and I know one of your areas of focus is adaptability. How do we adapt to the new realities and be flexible and agile enough to find a way that works for everyone, both organizations and employees alike? So that's, I think, the biggest management leadership challenge of our time, is in this changing world. No one has any answers because everything has changed. So, and there's no one size fits all solution, because it really, I always say the 2-word answer to any question is it depends, right? You get paid the big bucks if you can figure out what it depends on, but the answer to any question is it depends. It depends on your industry, your function, the culture, your location, like all of these various variables factor into what's the best way for you at this particular time to deal with your current situation. So I think that, again, using some of these visual thinking techniques I was talking about will help us to communicate. My mantra is, how do you get people to see what you're saying, right? So it's like, how do we also see what other people are saying as well? So I'll stop there, but those are a few of the key concepts. Is the world has changed drastically in just the last couple of years.
It has, and I think this vulnerability and humanity that leaders have once been the source of, show me the vision, show me the way, and have clarity over that, have, a sense of commitment, have a sense of knowing. Whereas now many don't know. I don't know what the vision's going to be. I don't know where we need to go. I don't know even how. So when you mentioned about the box having something in there, some are even just figuring out what that new vision even is. So before, it was a very different reality of maybe just expanding what existed before. And the vision of doing that was relatively thinkable. Whereas now we're requiring a new level of thought, a new level of imagination, a new level of unknowing being okay, of maybe as a leader, not having those answers and being comfortable with that. What are your thoughts around that situation? Because many leaders I've spoken to have often privately felt that, but felt uncomfortable about expressing the level of doubt, of unknowing or whatever in front of others because of this perception of what is expected of them. Is that something you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, Socrates said, all I know is that I know nothing, right? So it's like, even one of those most brilliant thinkers of all time confessed. So if you're a leader and you pretend or think you have all the answers, you don't. That's why leadership at every level from the bottom up is just as important as the top down. My mission statement for my company is making the world a better place, one leader at a time, and everyone is a leader in one way or another, right? So just changing the conception of what leadership is. There's a lot of people who have lofty titles who are terrible leaders, and people who have no titles who are amazing leaders. So it's about influencing, creating followership. Thought leadership involves both the thought and the leadership. You could have amazing ideas, but if you can't influence people and get them out into the world, then they're just only in your head, right? The old career path, and career path as a metaphor always implied like there were these stepping stones neatly laid out and you just stroll through the park. I say my career was a career roller coaster, ups and downs, twists and turns, exhilarating highs, terrifying plummets. My students love hearing about the times I was fired. One of my classic stories is the boss who threw a box of pens at my head because they were not the ones she wanted. So just, and the old career path used to be for like baby boomers, Gen Xers, which I am on the cusp of, you start out in the mailroom, right? And you aspire to the corner office. Well, there's no mailroom anymore because there's no mail. There's only email. And I don't think there's a room for that. And the corner office, does anyone even care about that anymore? I'd rather have a corner office in my own apartment, right? In my own home, or get a corner table at Starbucks to do my work. When I talk about 4 Ns. We live in a world where anyone at any time can do anything from anywhere, right? So in the world of the 4 Ns, physical geography, like everything's changed, like all the old rules don't apply. So I think in a way it's a challenge and it's confusing and overwhelming. On the other hand, it's an opportunity to reinvent what work should look like and be like and what you want your place in it to be.
And I guess that comes down to fundamentally mindset, in terms of an event viewed by 2 people can be the same event, but 2 very different viewpoints of that. And all of these inputs that we have, inputs of experience, inputs of listening to other people, of reading, help us to reimagine, to rethink. But it's hard when it's so ingrained, when it's ingrained in culture that's not just a team or company culture, but might be a country's culture or a societal or an industry-led culture that bucking this trend. And you mentioned early on, when we see so many people going, turning right, great leaders turn left, and the opportunity to maybe even think about there isn't just a left and right, but there's so many different directions and all of them can lead to joy and failure. So therefore just take some steps,
One of my metaphors I use all the time is from a leadership perspective, we look through a telescope or binoculars out into the future. But if we do that, we're not looking down into the details. So sometimes we need to take out the telescope or the magnifying glass and look down. So sometimes we're looking far and wide, other times down and deep. But like you just reminded me, sometimes it's good to look at the world through a kaleidoscope, right? See all the colors of the rainbow and see things from a new prism or a new perspective. So we need to, again, that's a metaphor I often use from a visual thinking perspective. It's like just putting on the same old lenses I wore when I was 12 is not going to help me see more clearly, right? So we need to see things, and your reflective yellow glasses are a whole other way of seeing the world, right? No, one of the concepts I was talking about, my rainbow colored eye on the cover of my book represents the fact that just as no one in the world has this color eye, no one in the world sees the world through the same lens that you do, right? And we need to remember that.
Is that Ben Hardy, you mentioned, somebody we both know, where he talks about the selective attention, our eyes only see and our ears only hear what our brain's looking for, was a, surmising of that by, again, Dan. And this, view that how can we shift our perspective? And I'm going to change a little bit of direction here because there's a couple of things that have triggered in my mind. One is I just wanted to share with you, I absolutely love TV and films myself. I really, it's a place I go to learn, to be inspired, but I'm abstaining for the whole of August with my wife. We decided no TV for August. So we're going to get, out more, do other things. So I'm on day 5 of that and still going okay. But one of the last things I watched was How to Change Your Mind, the series on Netflix. And the first one was all about LSD. The second one is all about magic mushrooms and psilocybin. And when you mentioned about seeing the world through a kaleidoscope and what we might open up, I've grown up in a society and culture where both my parents were teachers. I never smoked. I've, never had a pint of beer in my life or wine. I had a few bits of alcohol in college, but then I haven't drunk since. So I'm a teetotal, haven't experienced those things. And I find myself now, Todd, being curious about some of these things that I thought from society, 60s and 70s, these things are, where you go to space out or they're not right, or the trips, to thinking, how might that unlock some creativity? And I'm fascinated by it. And I'm finding this resurgence of something that was perhaps once viewed in one way is now maybe being a reawakening. Has that come across your world at all, of that kind of unlocking of creativity, of seeing the world with different tools than maybe the traditional tools?
My friend Brian Mattamore, who's an ideation and innovation specialist, always talks about stimuli, and it could be mental stimuli. It could be, so some of the things that you're talking about are like, pharmaceutical stimuli, right? Or, just flipping TV channels or going out into nature. I went to the workshop up in a mountain resort in Lake George, and I gave everyone a big index card and colored markers, and they had to go out into nature and just sketch anything from nature that was a metaphor about leadership. And we came back, and everyone came back with a different picture because they saw things from their lens, like what drew them and use of color and everything else. I'm similar to you. I've never been drunk. I've never smoked pot. I've never had a puff of a cigarette. I just started drinking wine when I turned 40, just as a social thing. So yeah, I can't even relate to, though I am curious about the impacts of some of those things. So I think we're alike in that way. But I think we can get a stimuli. Like a physical object around me. This I keep on my desk to remind me to always think globally. I live in New York, and it's very easy to have just a New York perspective on everything. This reminds me to think globally and see things from multiple perspectives. I use a lot of baseball analogies, but I remember if I'm talking to someone from the UK, I may use soccer, or someone from India, I may use cricket, or someone from Australia, I may use rugby, right? So you want to speak the language of your audience or your listener. I don't know if you guys do you guys have Curious George over there?
We do. Yeah.
So
in fact, I have the album as well.
Okay. Yeah. Great. So having this on my desk always reminds me to be curious, ask why, dig deeper. So I always keep Gumby. I don't know if you have Gumby here. It's a cartoon from the 60s. Reminds me to be flexible and bend over backwards to serve my clients. So I always, I remind my coaching clients, there's no magic wand. If you want to improve, you need to do the work. There's no crystal ball. If you want to know the future, you need to create it. I could go on for hours.
I just have to take a pause, Todd, for the people who are listening to this. We have just experienced, and I can see the influence now of the TV industry,
pop culture, yes,
of the pop culture, of each of these things that Todd just described, grabbed and showed. And that visual clue of connection, of being able to learn, to have an event, to have this stimulus in this multi-sensory world that we live. If you're just listening to the audio, you missed out on a real
hopefully
adventure.
People will come and watch the video version.
Yeah.
And the last one, if your mind is closed and said, this doesn't apply to me, you're limited. But if you expand your mind, it creates all this space for possibilities and new ways of thinking. So I'll leave it with that. I could go on for hours, but I'll stop there.
And these, it might create a smile. It might create a reference for somebody, but there is some really significant meaning and lessons that we can take from a lot of these things, whether I like thinking in analogies and metaphors and communicating in that way. It's how I learn, and it's how I then teach, and we often perpetuate our same kind of things of what resonates with us. When you mentioned about your book, you wrote it in a way that you like to read books.
Exactly.
So the challenge then is how, in this hyper contextualization requirement, that we can also be hyper personalized, and we can meet people where they need to be met in order to realize what their own reality is. So as you mentioned, the state and situation influenced what somebody would sketch when they go out. And if we're all given a similar challenge, we'll approach it in many, many different ways. That's the beauty of things. But a lot of organizations have tried to create consistency, tried to create continuity of experience, of flavor, of delivery. And yet by nature as humans, we're so divergent. And I think this opportunity is now really coming out of the divergency of humans in what we want to redefine as even being work, and the disassociation of, work is drudgery, to work is now maybe play, and a connection to purpose. So in terms of, this world that we all now know is shifting, we're in an exponentially accelerated world. As a teacher, as an educator, working in universities, what is changing and shifting in the way in which universities are preparing the next wave of people to take advantage of these things? What's shifting, what's changing in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for all universities or programs, but in addition to teaching at NYU, one of my roles is to do faculty education. So I train other faculty members in visual thinking and in experiential learning. So all of these techniques, like the use of props, like the use of visuals. If I'm observing a professor, true story, one of the professors, so I basically sit in on the class, I debrief, I help them figure out how do I turn a lecture into an activity, right? One professor got up and said, the first half hour is going to be really boring, but it gets more interesting later. Can you imagine going to a Broadway show where they say the first few songs really suck, but it gets better after intermission? It's like, that does not fly, right? I said to him, why is it boring? And I said, is it boring to you? He said, no, it's fascinating. I said, why is it fascinating? And he got so animated telling me the story. I'm like, hit the pause button. I wish I recorded that, because that's what you need to do in your class. If you're saying to your students, this is boring, why should they even pay attention to you? But the passion you just displayed here, you got me engaged. I'm not even interested in your subject matter. So he was like, that light bulb went off in him. Like, yeah, I never thought about it that way before, right? So that, putting up PowerPoint slides and they're just one bullet point after another and just reading them line by line is just deadly. And yet people are still doing it, right? If I say to people, would you have wanted to sit through your presentation? They say, no. It's like, then why are you? PowerPoint was not invented to be a torture device, right? So if you could figure out a way to be creative, use imagery, make it engaging, interactive, gamification is big, right? I love that you said play. My friend Aisha Bursell, who wrote this book over my shoulder, Design the Life You Live. She was an award-winning furniture and product designer who now applies her design thinking principles to designing a life that you want to live, or designing a future. So if you think about, just because business is serious, it doesn't mean it can't be playful and fun, right? So if you have a sense of passion and purpose, if you bring creativity and innovation to what you do, you're going to be more engaged. So like, why are engagement scores still like 30% after when they've been doing the same surveys all these years? No, nothing's changed. So we need to engage the person. So that's my soapbox. But I think if we make work fun, then people are going to put their heart and soul into what they're doing. And we need to treat people as people, not as cogs in a machine. Because,
And I think engagement is just kind of even just the first thing at the door. We should be aiming for more than that. We should be aiming for thriving. We should be aiming for where we are, stimulated in all senses, not just, I'm engaged. And maybe that is ultimate engagement, that you get to this sense of thriving. Now, it's interesting because in my book, I'm talking this challenge around finding moments of play. Often people, and I've been guilty of it in the past, I ran lots and lots of workshops around innovation, around trying to get moonshot innovation, the horizon 3, the stuff at the edge, and trying to create an environment that fosters that. And we often talk about psychological safety. We talk about the way in which actually it's safe to have ideas in here. And maybe that isn't going far enough, because I've been thinking about this reality of, if we can play when play's allowed, how good is that? If we can play when it's not allowed, it comes back to my thought around care. Can we care when it's inconvenient? Can we be like the Monkey King? Can we be playful even in a life and death situation? And often, no, it becomes serious in proportion to the level of risk or how, life and death it is. What if we flip that and reversed it, Todd? What if when we're in the worst situation of everything's gone to insert whatever word you want, can we still be playful then? Do you think that would be an advantage, or do you think that's just maybe taking it a bit too far?
Yeah, I think everything's proportionate, so there's no one answer. But yeah, even in times of stress, even if you incorporate some playfulness, some fun, it unlocks ideation, it unlocks creativity. I was once brought in to facilitate a one-day innovation session, and I started out with, it was going from like 9 to 5. I started with a warm-up just to help people connect and bond and create that psychological safety and create this environment where innovation would flow. The CEO, at about 45 minutes into my icebreaker, said, all right, we've been here for 45 minutes. We haven't come up with one new business idea yet. And the clock is ticking and we only have 7 hours left. And like that is not the best environment in which to come up with a new product and service ideas. It's like you need to allow things to flow and to unfold. And to one of my mantras is that team bonding needs to come before team building, and you need to connect to each other if you want to work better with each other. So I take people through a process that helps to foster that environment, that culture and climate of psychological safety, and to unlock the box of creativity. But this is someone who's like so tunnel vision. He's like, ideas. We're still looking at a blank piece of paper. So we need to realize, give ourselves some space to ideate and come up with new ideas and let the light bulbs go off. Because otherwise, you're just going to leave there 8 hours later saying we didn't come up with a single new idea. So that's a great point that we need.
It makes me think of a couple of things, Todd. One, about pressure. So that CEO, that person must have felt incredible pressure. Yeah. And thought that the application of that pressure would create a diamond. Now, you need to have the right element in the first place for that pressure and temperature to create that. If you, in another world, put that pressure in, then you might have an eruption that's destructive and doesn't create value of a diamond. And so that was one thing that was coming to me. And the other one was one of the people in our community, Haley, just ran a session, because we run regular sessions for our community to co-elevate. So a bit like you said about going in and helping your other lecturers and other professors to be better versions of themselves. As a community, we foster this co-elevation. I stole it from Keith Ferrazzi and Keith Ferrazzi's book all around co-elevation. And they use improv a lot. So they come from Second City, they use improv a lot in work. And the theme in this Zoom world, was connection before content. And so very similar to what you were talking about there of creating an environment for creativity before creating, is this connection before content. And so when we come in, right, I'm a task rabbit. So Todd, what we've got to do this podcast, right? Got to get it done, right? I need to get it really engaging. I've got these kind of things I want to cover, and actually just connect. Yeah. And how do we connect so that we can have a jam, we can have that jazz, we can have a conversation that people want to listen to, and that gain value from. The difference of the PowerPoint that everyone was bored to the ignited passion, that if I can ignite some of your passion about what you care about, then others will listen and that will resonate, and we'll get this. I've talked about mass hysteria being a positive influence. What if mass hysteria was used in a way to spread a positive virus of engagement? And so as we come to the final stages, Todd, the visual leadership and your model, and not only using these methodologies or frameworks or principles, you've got a great TED talk that starts to introduce that, and the book's available in lots of different areas and ways, and I'm looking forward to diving into that. In terms of some practical things that an organization could do or a leader could do to maybe shortcut to the first stepping stone to the power of visual leadership, what would you say do? Is it pick up a pen and use that and say, no words for this meet? What is it that might just get them started to experience?
There's so many, like, but one example, building on the one, I wrote an article for Inc. magazine, and if you just Google, can you draw what your company does, you can find the article. I do an exercise where people have to get up and basically they have 5 minutes to draw a picture of and explain it to us what it is that you do. So long story short, I was doing this with a group of pharmaceutical salespeople. One guy drew a picture of a big whale eating goldfish, saying this is us and we're eating up the competition. But then the vice president said that's not accurate at all, because a lot of our competitors are bigger than us. It's not that we're a whale, but he thought about it. He said it's more like our competitors are sharks, because they just bite off the business and swim away, leaving you bleeding. We're more like dolphin. We're smart, we're fun, we're playful, we're cuddly, we're almost human in many ways. So they went from whale versus goldfish to dolphin versus shark. So the dolphin became their metaphor of how they were going to treat people, interact with people. So just that one conversation, had that guy not drawn the wrong answer, we wouldn't have gotten to there's no right answer, but to a better answer, right? So just that one exercise summed up the power of the pen to illustrate something and get a conversation flowing so you could see things. And even if it's wrong, there's a English philosopher, George Box, who once said that in regard to mental models and frameworks, all models are wrong but some are useful. And I love that because they're wrong because they don't accurately reflect the reality 100%. But if there's utility there, if it will help us to see things in a new way or to find some solution, then it was useful. Like a map of the London subway or the New York subway is not geographically accurate, and yet it gets you around from point A to point B, right? So think about that, like use color coding, use mapping, mind mapping, storyboarding, Post-its, just get ideas out of your head onto some medium that other people could see what you're saying, and then you can have all these great conversations. So in my book, I break it down to use some visual imagery and drawing, mental models and frameworks, like your excellent AQ model, little plug there, doing my homework, using metaphors and analogies, and using storytelling and humor if and when appropriate. So those are my 4 buckets. And when used in combination, it's even more powerful. So when people say, all right, this is great, I get visuals, they increase our attention, comprehension, and retention, as I talk about in my TED Talk, right? It gets us to pay attention, to understand, and to remember. Now it's like, all right, how I understand it, I get it, I'm bought in. How do I do this? That's the next step. And that's what I focus on, is teaching people how to do this in real life.
I love it. And I think if you can hold a pen, you can draw.
Exactly. Yeah.
And again, just unlearning maybe the identity or limiting factors of what you've put onto yourself about what you can or can't do. Yeah. It's all a level of perspective of those things. It's a game that we've played on our weekly happy hours that we have, is using the whiteboards in Zoom to do Pictionary. Yeah. And just draw things, and it's great fun, and it sparks conversation, and that whole practice of doing that I really enjoy. There was a quote that you used in the end of your TED Talk, and I can never remember who said it, but I use the essence of it many times a week, and it's about seeing things through new eyes. Yeah. And it leads me to my final question that I ask guests around curiosity, Todd. And as we go through life, maintaining this level of beautiful curiosity to discover whether it's a brand new thing or the same thing through new eyes, what was the last thing you did for the first time, and what was it?
Wow, that's an amazing question. The last thing I did for the first time. I have to say, I'm almost stumped. It's the last thing I did for the first time. My wife usually drives. I haven't driven in like 2 years because of the pandemic, and we take subways most of the time in New York. So I haven't driven in a long time. So it was interesting just to get behind the wheel of a car again. It almost felt like the first time. It felt like a new driver. So that's the first thing that popped into my head. I was almost like, all right, how do I hold my hands, and which is the gas pedal again? So it's funny how things that we've done our whole lives, if we haven't done it for a long time, including public speaking, like many of us who've been on Zoom over the last couple of years for the pandemic. I just did my first in-person training recently, and that almost felt like, all right, how do I do this again? It all came back pretty quickly, but yeah, you get rusty if you don't use it, you lose it. So yeah, I would say a lot of it. I wonder how many skills have atrophied over the last couple of years. Yeah. I play softball on 2 softball teams in Central Park, and I still did well, but I was like, all right, how do I do this again? So that's a great point, is that we can get very rusty if we don't keep our skills up and unlearn and relearn things.
Yeah, and it's a thought designed to be arresting, to be thoughtful, to consider, okay, when really was the last time I did something for the first time? And do I take that literally? Or do I take it that, could I bring that to everything I do? Can I make it feel like the first time? When I hug my wife, can it feel like the first time I'm hugging her? When I kiss my wife, can I make it feel like it was the first time I kissed her? When I'm, speaking to a member of the team about something. And there's this beauty of firsts and, multiple, because it gives us an opportunity to be okay with not getting it right, and to use your ears and your eyes so much more when we're doing something first time. A bit like you said, where do I put my hands on the steering wheel? When we're just more observant.
It's just noticing, right? It's about noticing. I do a whole exercise in my NYU class around that. In fact, I do a Zoom icebreaker where I have people, I say, look around your room, find something in your environment that either makes you laugh or smile or something that you're proud of. And it can't be a picture of your family because that's just boring. So anything else. And everyone just gets up and runs around, and there's things right in front of you that's like, yeah, there's this award, like, the little Shakespeare head that's sitting on my desk that I haven't even noticed in a long time. And this is the Batman version where you tip the head back so you can get down to the bat. So, but sometimes things are right in front of us. I keep this snail shell here to remind me to slow down, not talk so fast. It doesn't work. My wife gave me that to remind me. But the whole point is because I don't notice it anymore because it's so right in front of me. So that quote you mentioned, the Marcel Proust, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new lands, but in seeing with new eyes. That's a great practice. Is just to take a few minutes out of your day just to notice something or even a person and acknowledge something you hadn't paid attention to in a while.
Your desk must be like the TARDIS, Todd. It must be this huge, I'm envisaging a big desk with various things that are all accessible to you. And I'm going to share one last thing before we say farewell for now. And that is, have you come across the My Intent bracelets?
No.
So I came across it in, I think it was probably 2018 at a Peter Diamandis conference called Abundance at A360. And he had the founder there of this company called My Intent. And he described how we are so driven by time. What is the time? Where do I need to be? How long have I got? Hey, there's only 7 hours left and we haven't even got an idea down on page. And we're constantly looking at the time, whether it's on a watch or on our phones now, we're constantly looking at the time.
Especially if you live in a big city like New York, it's like, what time is that train? Or what time is it? Or it takes 8 minutes to get there unless I take an Uber. It's like, yeah, we're constantly doing
And this obsession with time, do we have an obsession with how we're spending that time? Mm-hmm. And so he created these little, basically donut type bracelets. And you would put your word. It might be a word that could be slow down, or it could be something you want to bring more of in your life. My wife, it's compassion, something that's there. And mine, I've in fact got two. One is Unite Humanity, was the first one I got in 2018. I then felt a bit overwhelmed by it, Todd. At the beginning, it was inspiring. Then it became maybe that's a little bit big. And then later I said to myself, well, why can't I have two? Yeah. And so my second one is Co-Elevate. And that really was an interesting one. So that hasn't come off my wrist since 2018. Wow. And this one probably 2019. And it's just that way of thinking about how do I want to show up? What are the things that are for me in the world? And so seeing with new eyes, seeing these experiences, to always think, is what I'm doing helping humanity unite? Is what I'm doing helping people to co-elevate? And for me, that's what excites me. That's what motivates me to come in and show up and give it my best shot each day. So I want to say a true thank you for not only taking the time in this session, but in before, in your prep, in your work, and taking this with real intent to show up as value. I've learned loads, and I'm sure many of our listeners have too. If people want to get in touch with you, Todd, what's the best way?
Yeah, the best way is to go to my website, toddcherches.com, and just sign up for my newsletter and check me out, and also connect with me on LinkedIn. Just say you saw me on Ross's show, and we'll continue the conversation on LinkedIn. I live on LinkedIn, so I'm always there, and I love engaging with people. So those are the two best ways.
Magic. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Ross.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit AQai.io to gain your personalized report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQ-Me assessment. AQai, transforming the way people teams and organizations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.